In order to understand the earliest history of the Kolodny family, it is necessary to know about the political and religious landscape of Eastern Europe in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In 1791, Empress Catherine II of Russia declared that all Jews were to live within a geographic area known as the Pale of Settlement. The Pale stretched through territory that includes present-day Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus. It is not known exactly when the Kolodnys first settled within the Pale, but by the early 1800s the family had roots around the city of Pinsk, which today is in the southwestern portion of Belarus. Another important development in the late 18th century were the laws forcing Jews to take a surname. For thousands of years in the Jewish tradition, a Jewish person was known by their given name and their father's name. As Jews became more secular, many adopted surnames of their own, but starting in the 1780s, all Jewish people in Europe had to acquire or were given a last name. Many took a name based on where they lived, their occupation, or other random criteria. According to Beit HaTfutzot, the Museum of the Jewish Diaspora in Tel Aviv, the name Kolodny is primarily a place name, having been adopted by those who lived in the town of Kolodno, located 10 miles east of Bialystok. A cooper may have also assumed the name, since Kolodno derives from the word meaning log and was a lumber center. The furthest back I've been able to trace a Kolodny ancestor is to my great-great-great-grandfather, whose name was Shmuel Michal, the patriarch of the Kolodny family. Very little is known about him other than the approximate year of his birth, 1820 to 1835, and the fact that he lived in what is today southwestern Belarus. He married a woman named Frida Greenberg, and in 1852 she gave birth to their first child, my great-great-grandfather Tzvi, who was also known in the family as Hersh. The couple went on to have 4 more children, Yankel, Rezel, Yussel, and Chashki, all who lived within the same area not too far from Pinsk, but in different towns and shtetls. 20 miles to the west of Pinsk was the city of Yanova, and about 10 miles north of Yanova, on the banks of the Isolda River, was a smaller town known as Muttel. All of the patriarch's children were born and raised in a shtetl located between Yanova and Muttel. Hersh's youngest daughter, Yetta, explains.
The shtetl, it was 2 names. It was Krasivke, and then a big politician. He came from a bigger city. They used to come to check who paid taxes and how everything is going on. So he was from the government. Yeah. So he passed by. He came to our Delfele, and it was a rainy week, and it was a lot of mud. So that politician, he said, "Ooh, it smerdiachi."
That's how it got to be a Smiyachi.
So it was the name, but the truth is it was Krasivki.
Shmuel Michal and Frida's second son Yankel made his home in Yanova and was a tailor by trade. What is interesting about Yankel is the fact that his surname was not Kolodny. In the early to mid-19th century, there was the law of conscription that drafted young men into the Russian army for a period of 25 years or more. The oldest son of a family was generally not taken for military service. Rather, a second or third son was a more viable choice to be drafted into the army. In order to avoid being seen by government officials as the second Kolodny son, Yankel took a different last name.
He wanted to avoid to go to the army.
I see.
Uncle Yankel. He was a smart fellow.
Yeah.
So he went, you know what a politician could do. Money can buy what a politician could do. So he wanted to avoid, not to go.
Mm-hmm.
So they gave him the advice, you know, a politician, so they went through the whole process, and they told him his name will be Greenberg. So, but in the truth, he was Kolodny.
Yeah.
So that's how.
How he took the name Greenberg, yeah.
So instead of taking his father's surname, Kolodny, Yankel took his mother's maiden name, Greenberg. From that point forward, Yankel and his children's children were to be known as the Greenbergs. In 1856, Shmuel and Frieda had their first daughter and named her Sarah Razel, known commonly among the family as Razel. Shmuel and Freida's family was completed with two more children, Yussel and Chashki. But Shmuel had other children. Many details are not known for certain, but Shmuel had another wife whose name was Nechama. In his marriage with Nechama, the patriarch had a daughter named Esther and a son named Yoshia, bringing his total number of children to 7. In the 1870s, Shmuel Michel's children began to start families of their own, beginning with Hirsch, who married Leah Greenberg, the only child of Max Greenberg and Hannah Schechter. Yankel married Ethel Varia. Razel married Tzadok Weissman. Chashki married Joseph Gerstel, and Yoshia married Yentl. It is not known if Esther married, and we have no record of any descendants. Yussel's fate was a tragic one, as he was killed at the young age of 19, perhaps by the Cossacks. In the following 2 decades, the family grew with at least 5 of the patriarch's children having children of their own, including Hirsch and Leah's first child, who was born in 1878. It is not known when the patriarch Shmuel Michel died, but it can be assumed he lived a life of no more than 60 years, as Hirsch and Leah's first child was named Shmuel Michel, known as Michel among the family, presumably named after his deceased grandfather. Their other children included Joseph, Israel, who was my great-grandfather, Isidore, Ida, and Yetta. In total, the patriarch had 31 grandchildren who were all born and grew up in Russia in the late 19th century, where life was hard and the winters were long and cold. Some chose a life of religious study, attending the Cheder, as Michel did as a young man. An interesting side note pertains to one of Michel's classmates at the Cheder, a student named Chaim Weizmann, who was from Muttel. Weizmann went on to become the first president of the State of Israel in 1948. Other than religious study, some members of the family chose a trade or a profession and made a simple living as a tailor or a carpenter. It was during this time, in the 1880s and 1890s, that many Jews in Russia had set their sights on a better life for themselves and their families. A movement was taking place that would drastically affect millions of people and millions more in the generations that followed.
We are leaving Mother Russia. We have waited far too long. We are leaving Mother Russia. When they come for us, we'll be gone.
At the dawn of the 20th century, many individuals were faced with a difficult decision: continue to live under the laws of the Russian Empire, where Jews were subject to pogroms and waves of violence because of their religious beliefs, or pursue the American dream, where the streets were said to be paved with gold. It's hard to imagine just how difficult a decision it was to leave the small towns and shtetls the family inhabited for generations and go to a foreign land and a big city with no job, little money, no formal secular education, and no knowledge of the English language. The first member of the family to leave Russia for the New World appears to be Shana Michla Gerstel, daughter of Chashki and Joseph. She came to the United States in 1901 and settled in Detroit. The following year, Razel's husband Tzadok Weissman and their 2 sons, Max and Louis, immigrated to the United States. Tzadok saved enough money to be able to have Razel and their 2 daughters, Rachel and Frieda, join them in New York in 1904. That same year, my great-grandfather Israel, traveling by himself, arrived at Ellis Island, completing a journey that took several weeks. The first leg of Israel's trip from Yanova was to head west, probably by train out of Russia, through Poland, across Germany, and into Holland, a distance of over 1,000 miles. His final destination on the west coast of the European continent was the port city of Rotterdam. On October 22, 1904, Israel boarded the SS Amsterdam with 692 other steerage passengers and 100 first-class passengers, setting sail across the Atlantic bound for New York. The ship docked on November 2nd, and Israel stepped foot on U.S. soil with $4.50 in his pocket. He was to join his brother Isidore, who had arrived just months earlier. Within 2 years, the rest of Israel and Isidore's siblings decided to come to New York as well. The two oldest, Michal and Joseph, had already married and had children in Russia, while Ida and Yetta were still single. What they all had in common was their youth and a desire to begin a new life, a better life for themselves and their children. Back in Krasilke, Hirsch and Leah remained. One would imagine their situation was different from that of their 6 children. They were in their mid-50s, more accustomed to and accepting of life in Russia. Picking up and leaving could not have been so easy for them, but that is what they decided to do. Hirsch and Leah arrived in New York aboard the SS Rindam and were reunited with their children on December 11th, 1907. As for the rest of the patriarch's children, Yankel came to the United States and settled in Chicago, but Chashki did not come to America. Neither did his children Esther or Yoshia from his other marriage. At the time my great-grandfather Israel arrived in New York in 1904, he was only 19 years old. He was a tailor by trade, but also performed odd jobs to make ends meet. He came to know a woman named Lena Putterman, a daughter of Sam and Tilly Putterman. Israel and Lena were married on June 18, 1908, at 238 Eldridge Street in Manhattan. Just 10 months later, the couple had their first child, my grandfather Meyer, born on March 12, 1909, and not long after, my grandfather's sister Ruth was born in 1911. At that time, Israel's parents Hirsch and Leah made their home at 160 Essex Street with their 3 unwed children, Isidore, Ida, and Yetta, and their nephew Louis Greenberg and niece Frida Greenberg. Hirsch earned a living as a sweet potato vendor, selling his wares out of a pushcart on the streets, much like the man in this photo. This all took place on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which was the center of life for the family, as it was for so many thousands of Jews in New York City. Life in New York was certainly very different than what everyone was accustomed to back in the shtetl. They were living in cramped quarters in a very densely populated area of the city, as opposed to the open spaces and countryside surroundings of rural Russia. But they also enjoyed complete religious freedom and the ability to express themselves in the political arena however they chose. Many members of the family had strong ties to the socialist movement as a carryover from life in the old country. But before too long, many earned a good living, some had their own businesses, acquired valuable assets, and were enjoying life in the new capitalist society. One of the earliest success stories of the family in the new country was Tzadok Weissman, husband of Razel Kolodny, as remembered by their granddaughter.
He was the first Republican in the family because he bought property where we live on Van Siclen Avenue, and his friend, the lawyer, told him that if he's a property owner, he has to be a Republican. My father, who was a socialist,
Right.
drove him crazy because this didn't match.
While many of the Kolodnys enjoyed personal happiness and professional success, there were also instances of hardship, sickness, and tragedy. In 1913, my great-grandmother Lena contracted tuberculosis and succumbed to the disease 5 years later, leaving her husband Israel to support their 2 children, Meyer and Ruth, who were only 9 and 7 years old. Israel turned to the family for help and found support in many different ways, especially from Lena's sister Rose. In times of need, members of the family had to fill roles they were not accustomed to or prepared for, even if it meant marriage. In 1919, Israel wed Rose, and a year later they had a son together named Seymour. Shortly after, tragedy struck the family again. On February 3, 1921, Hirsch left his home, now at 115 Stanton Street, for a normal day of work peddling sweet potatoes. Perhaps the roads were icy on that winter day, but standing at the corner of Stanton and Essex Streets, Hirsch was struck by a Hecker's flour truck and died that same day. His wife Leah was devastated and never really recovered from the tragedy of that fateful day. Just 14 months later, Leah passed away. Her cause of death was myocarditis, but family members would later say she simply died of a broken heart. By the 1920s, the Kolodnys left the tenements of the Lower East Side and moved to homes in the East New York section of Brooklyn. Michal, his wife Pesha, and their children Meyer, Louis, Anne, and Itzhak lived at 98 Amboy Street. His sister Ida, who married Harry Adams, and their children Minnie, Hi, Meyer, Rita, and Cecilia lived at 436 Snedeker Avenue. Their sister Yetta, who married Hyman Wasserman, lived at 559 New Jersey Avenue with their children David, Isidore, Francis, Mickey, and Harold. And their brother Joseph, wife Rose, and children Anna, Meyer, Samuel, Max, and Irving also lived in the neighborhood nearby. The only one of the 6 Kolodny siblings who did not live in East New York was Isidore. He settled with his wife Celia and children Maxwell, Saul, Mimi, and Leonard at 241 Riverdale Avenue in Yonkers. Isidore owned and operated his own dry cleaning store called Kolodny Cleaners, located at the street level of the family residence. My great-grandfather Israel, with his second wife Rose, and 3 children, Meyer, Ruth, and Seymour, took residence at several different locations in the 1920s, including 890